This is a CNN special presentation. From Havana, Cuba, join Turner Broadcasting Chairman Ted Turner for A Conversation with Fidel Castro.
Hi, I'm Ted Turner, and I've spent 2 very interesting days here in Cuba, traveling around with President Fidel Castro, who's led this country since its revolution 31 years ago. That makes him the 3rd most senior leader in the world today. He joins us from the Palace of the Revolution in Havana. Buenos dias, Presidente.
Buenos días, Ted.
In the United States, we hear that there are severe economic problems in Cuba. Is this true?
Bueno, sí.
Well, yes, we do have economic difficulties,
Igual que la tienen todos los países
like
de América Latina
all countries in Latin America,
y del resto de los países en
as well as the rest of the developing countries.
No usar la terminología
Not to use the third world term, which I know, Ted, you don't like.
Esa dificultad las hemos tenido.
We've had these difficulties for a long time now,
explicables en parte.
which are, to a certain extent, due to the fact, if we take into account that the United States has been blockading the country for over 30 years and sabotaging our economy, prohibiting the export even of aspirins to our country.
Es posible incluso que tengamos mayores dificultades.
It is even possible that we might have greater difficulties in the future, depending on how events evolve in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union.
Pero a pesar de todo,
But despite everything,
nuestros niveles de salud
our health
están
levels
por encima de cualquier otro
are
país
above
en desarrollo
any other developing
y por
country
encima
and
de
above
muchos países
many
desarrollados.
developed countries.
Nuestros niveles de educación están
Our educational
igualmente por
levels
encima de
are
cualquier otro país
likewise
del
above
tercer mundo
any other third world country
y por encima de muchos
and
países
above many
desarrollados.
developed countries.
Podríamos decir que nuestros niveles
We
de
could
educación
say
y de
that
salud
our
compiten con los de
educational
Estados
and
Unidos.
health levels are competing with
Y
those
unos
of the United
cuantos
States.
índices
And
están
in
por
several
encima,
indices, we are above
ya
them,
que no tenemos
since
analfabetismo
we do not have any
y
illiteracy,
los analfabetos
and the
funcionales son
functional
un mínimo en
illiterates
nuestro país.
are a minimum
Estados Unidos
group
son
in our
decenas
country,
de
and in the
millones.
United States it's tens of millions.
Well, thank you. I know this is a difficult question, but Cuba has been accused in the past years of being involved in the drug trafficking business. How would you like to answer that statement?
Bueno, primero habría que ver quiénes nos acusan.
Well, first of all, we would have to see who are the ones that are accusing us.
En realidad,
And
algunas
actually,
veces esas acusaciones han salido de gente
Sometimes these
que ha estado
charges
sancionada
have come from people who have been
y le han ofrecido
sanctioned,
todo tipo
and
de
they have been offered
beneficios para
all
que
sorts
no
of benefits,
Detrás de
so
esas
that they accuse
acusaciones,
Cuba.
hay
Behind these charges, Ted, there is a political objective,
son absolutamente calumniosos.
and they are totally slanderous. We can say that they are truly cynical,
Porque paradójicamente
because
creo
paradoxically speaking, I believe that the
que en el
country
mundo ha tenido una conducta
that
más
has had the best behavior in the world with respect to drugs is Cuba.
Nuestro país no consume
Our country
drogas.
does
Muy
not
excepcional.
consume drugs.
Los casos de consumo
There
de
could be
drogas,
some
a pesar
exceptional
de que la
cases of
marihuana,
drug
por
consumption,
ejemplo,
despite the fact that marijuana, for
habitación
instance,
como
could be harvested in a room like this.
Nuestro país no conoce el
Our
consumo
country
de la cocaína.
Has no experience about the consumption of cocaine. It simply does not exist in the country.
Yo creo que si todos hubieran
I
hecho,
believe
todos los
that
países
if
hubieran
all
hecho
countries
con relación a las drogas,
had done what Cuba did with respect to drugs, we would not have the problem of drugs in the world.
desgraciadamente tuvimos el caso de
Unfortunately,
algunos funcionarios que se
We
corrompieron.
had the case of some officials that were corrupted and became the accomplices of some drug trafficking activities. But the response of our country was exemplary, as no other country has responded.
Sancionamos con las penas más
We
severas.
sentenced them with the most severe sanctions. That is in the case of the officials
En el tráfico de drogas,
who were
con lo cual creo que
proved
hemos
to
arrancado
participate
de
in this
raíz
drug trafficking. And with this, I believe we
este
have
mal.
totally rid ourselves from this evil. We have expressed our readiness even to do coordination activities with other countries, with the Mexicans know this, the government of Colombia knows this. On the other hand, the government of the United States has not accepted any type of agreement with respect to this question of drug trafficking because of political problems. The administration does not want their friends from Miami criticizing it because of signing some sort of an agreement with Cuba as to drug trafficking. Our laws are harsh, but if it were necessary, we could even draw up even harsher laws because we are felt indignant, offended when drug traffickers try to use our territory to do activities of this nature. Naturally, there are 3 air routes crossing our country. If we banned these air routes, that would cost hundreds of millions of dollars to the enterprises that travel over Cuba. We could not do this either because that would violate the international agreements. We cannot register the planes that travel through the corridors. But in the end, I believe that we have been exemplary in fulfilling our duties as to international traffic. We are ready to reach any international agreement and take any measures necessary as a contribution to the struggle against this tragedy of drug trafficking.
On the other hand, we understand that you're easing restrictions on religious expression and that the Pope may even visit Cuba next year. Could you explain, please?
What I can say is that religious expressions have actually had total freedom of expression in our country, and that is well known. There were certain conflicts that came up during the initial years of the revolution with the Catholic Church, and not with the Catholic Church as such, but rather with the hierarchy of the Catholic Church, as a result of the fact that the Catholic religion had expanded mainly among the richest sectors of the population, and revolutionary laws did produce certain contradictions, serious contradictions between these sectors and the revolution. These sectors tried to use the church against the revolution, but despite everything, the problem was handled very carefully on the part of the revolutionary government. There was never a church closed. There were never any reprisal measures taken against religious expression, and witness to this are many churches in our country which have always maintained a relationship of respect toward the revolution. The problem was of a different nature, that is, when the party was created, and precisely as a result of these contradictions, which had come up with one of the churches, there had been very strict standards that were established as to entry in the party. This did not include in the party membership those who were religious. That was a junctural measure. Years have passed, and we believe that that is a discriminatory principle, and we have made the decision to overcome this difficulty, and therefore we are moving toward a policy of acceptance within the ranks of the party, of the people who, agreeing with the party program, with the revolution, and being ready to defend the homeland, do have some religious belief. Concerning the visit of the Pope, there is no agreement as to the possible date, so therefore we cannot speak about any future visit and the date of that visit to Cuba.
We're going to take a break now, and when we'll come back, we'll talk about Cuba's relations with the Soviet Union. Stay tuned. We're back with President Castro. President Castro, how do you feel about the changes in the Soviet Union, and have they affected Cuban relations with the Soviets?
Bueno,
Well,
todos estos temas son
all
siempre
these
altamente
issues
sensibles,
are
¿no?
highly sensitive all the time.
Yo quiero hablarle con toda
I would like to very
serenidad sobre
calmly
cuestiones. Nosotros no
speak about these matters.
tenemos derecho
We do not
a cuestionar
have any right
cualquier cambio que
to
quieran producir los
question
soviéticos.
any changes that the Soviets would like to introduce.
Ellos estimaron de que
They
se habían
considered
cometido una serie de errores a lo
that
largo de la
certain
historia,
mistakes had been made throughout history.
a lo largo de los 70 años de la
In the
revolución en su
70
país,
years since the revolution
y
triumphed in their country,
decidieron
and they
adoptar una serie de
decided
medidas para
to take several
perfeccionar el
measures
socialismo.
to streamline
Yo
socialism.
creo que nadie puede oponerse
I believe
a
that no one can oppose
eso,
that
absoluto.
at all.
Nosotros mismos, en
We
nuestro
ourselves,
caso,
in our case,
en determinados momentos,
at a given
también tomamos
moment also
conciencia de
became
ciertos
aware
errores,
of certain errors,
e iniciamos un proceso
and
de
we
rectificación.
began a process of
Esto desde
rectification.
el año 86,
This began
antes
in
de que se hablara de
1986,
cambios,
before changes
en la
were
Unión Soviética.
mentioned in the Soviet Union.
y por lo tanto
And
tenemos
therefore,
que respetar
we must,
como un derecho
respect
soberano de cada país
as a sovereign right of all
y de cada
countries
partido,
and of all parties,
adoptar las medidas que
to
estimen
the
pertinentes,
decision to make any changes that they deem
el proceso
pertinent
político
to improve
y para mejorar.
their political processes and improve socialism.
Luego, por una cuestión de principio, nosotros
So,
tenemos que respetar como un
based
derecho
on a
soberano
question
de
of
la Unión
principles, we
Soviética.
must respect as a sovereign right of the Soviet Union all the changes that they
Por
have
otro lado,
introduced.
a lo
On the other
largo de
hand,
estos años se han
throughout these
mantenido
years,
relaciones personales buenas
we have had good
con la dirección
personal
soviética, con el
relations
compañero Gorbachev,
with the leadership of the Soviet Union, with
relaciones de
Comrade
estimación,
Gorbachev, relations of
de
friendship, high esteem,
del
respect.
mismo modo que ellos respetan
In the
nuestra
same way that
soberanía
they respect our sovereignty, we also respect
de los soviéticos.
the sovereignty
Ellos
of
están
the
teniendo
Soviets.
dificultades,
They are
indiscutiblemente.
unquestionably
Ellos han estado
facing
encontrando
difficulties. They
dificultades
have met
tal vez mayores
even greater difficulties,
que las que
maybe
habrían
maybe
imaginado.
those that they would have imagined.
Pues yo no tengo ninguna
But
duda
I have no doubt
que el
whatsoever
compañero
about the fact that
Gorbachev
Comrade Gorbachev
está movido
is
con el
moved
propósito de mejorar el
by
socialismo.
the purpose
Pero
of
estas tareas históricas son muy
improving
complejas,
socialism. But these
complicadas.
historic tasks are very complex,
Y
very
esto,
complicated.
naturalmente, no ha sido
And
un camino
naturally, this has
fácil
not
para la
been
Unión Soviética.
an easy
Y han surgido
road to follow by the
numerosos
Soviet
problemas
Union, and many
que todo el mundo
problems have
conoce,
arisen, and
de
everybody
tipo
knows about
económico,
them.
de tipo
Economic,
político,
political problems,
tipo nacional,
national problems,
conflictos de tipos nacionales.
conflicts of a
Y
national
lógicamente,
type,
todo lo que
and logically,
afecte la
all
economía
those things that
soviética,
affect
independientemente
the
de la
Soviet
voluntad
economy,
de la dirección
independent of the
soviética,
will of the Soviet
puede
leadership,
afectar nuestras
may
relaciones
affect
económicas.
our economic
No
relations,
nuestras relaciones
not
políticas.
our political relations.
Si la Unión
If the
Soviética
Soviet
quiere
Union
incluso adoptar la
even wants
Constitución de
to
Estados Unidos,
adopt the U.S.
Nosotros
Constitution,
respetamos eso.
we respect that.
How do you feel about the events that have transpired recently in Eastern Europe? And were you happy to see the Berlin Wall come down?
bueno, hay muchas cosas mezcladas. en
Well,
esa pregunta.
this question has several sides to
En
it.
los países socialistas de Europa
In the socialist countries of Eastern Europe,
se han producido una serie de cambios
several changes have taken place.
que se iniciaron como
Changes that
proyectos de reforma
began as a project of
perfecta del
reforms
socialismo.
to improve
Varios de ellos, no en
socialism, and some of them, not in all
todos,
of
que no
them,
es una situación exactamente
because
igual.
the situation is not
cada uno de
exactly
estos
the same in each country.
En Polonia se habían producido
In
una
Poland,
serie de
there have
manifestaciones
been
de
several
descontento
expressions
hace
of
tiempo, hace
discontent
muchos años.
many years ago,
hace por lo menos
at least
8 años
8 years ago,
comenzaron a producirse
that
dificultades en Polonia,
difficulties started to arise in Poland, strikes, discontent,
dieron lugar a determinados
which
cambios
brought about certain
que venían
changes
produciéndose.
that had been taking
En
place.
otros países como
In other
RDA,
countries like the
Checoslovaquia,
GDR, Czechoslovakia,
eh,
Hungary, Romania, there were sudden changes by the end of last year. But in each of them, the situation is not the same as in the rest. However, we do notice a strong tendency toward changes in a sense that is contrary to socialism. And what was initially put forth as a reform to socialism has become a movement towards the building of capitalism. That is, they are becoming distant from the construction of socialism and moving toward the building of capitalism, following capitalist methods and capitalist mechanisms. In that sense, as a socialist and as a man that is fully convinced of what socialism means, of what socialism has meant for our country, I cannot agree with that movement in the socialist countries toward capitalism. But my idea is the following. We must respect the right of all countries to build the economic, social, and political system that they deem pertinent. Socialism in Cuba was not imported. It was not brought by anyone to Cuba. It did not come with any foreign troops. Our socialism in Cuba was built by us. It was done and supported by our people. It has been developed by our people, and therefore it is a very autochthonous revolution. You asked me about the Berlin Wall. I recall that the Berlin Wall was built as a result of the Cold War at times of great international tension, at times when the Soviet and American tanks were facing each other. We could say that the wall served to divide Soviet troops from U.S. troops. And I believe that at a moment when international detente begins, at a time when there is a change in the economic, social, and political system in the GDR, a wall like that of Berlin simply is meaningless. So therefore, it seems only logical and natural that that wall disappears. There's no reason for it to exist in the present circumstances. But the wall of Berlin is not the only wall. There are several walls. For instance, there is a wall that the U.S. is building in the border with Mexico. The U.S. there is building an electronic, sophisticated wall of 3,000 kilometers length to avoid the immigration of Mexicans. So therefore, you in the U.S. also have some experience about the walls, like, for example, the wall that is being erected now in the border with Mexico. And I would ask the U.S., when will that wall disappear, which is much more difficult to overcome than the Berlin Wall. This question of walls is not a characteristic only of a given area, but in Korea there's another wall. It is dividing both countries. And well, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea has protested for this wall, for the presence of U.S. troops there, and have put forth the proposal of unification of both countries. There are many walls. The wall built by the United States in the Guantanamo Bay. I ask myself, when will that wall come down? When will they return us our Guantanamo territory? Another wall has been built up in the Caribbean, which is the one that has been built by the United States between our two countries to avoid trade and relations. I would say that I would be happy if all walls disappear. That's my opinion, and that's the way I think.
tardes.
How do you feel about the recent events in Central America, and in particular the elections in Nicaragua?
Pienso que las elecciones en Nicaragua se
I believe that
desarrollaron en condiciones
elections in
muy
Nicaragua
difíciles
developed
para el
under
Frente
very
Sandinista,
difficult circumstances for the
en medio de una
Sandinista
crisis
front,
económica
in the midst of a
grande,
serious economic crisis
incrementada por el bloqueo de Estados Unidos,
increased by the U.S. blockade,
en
or
medio de una
worsened
guerra
by the
sucia,
U.S. blockade, also in the midst of
que
a
costó
dirty war,
decenas de miles de vidas.
which meant tens of thousands of losses,
Y esas elecciones fueron
and those
desfavorables a los
elections
revolucionarios.
were unfavorable for revolutionaries. The revolutionaries became a
Pero eso no
minority,
significa la
but that
desaparición de
does
la
not
revolución en Nicaragua.
mean the disappearance
Sino
of
que
the
los
Nicaraguan
revolucionarios
revolution, but rather that
se le plantea
revolutionaries
la
now
tarea histórica de
face the
recuperar la
historic
mayoría.
task of recovering that majority.
Ellos aceptaron las reglas
They
del
accepted
juego,
the rules of the game,
de los acuerdos,
the agreements
oposición,
with the opposition,
y tienen que atenerse
and
a esas reglas
they
del
must
juego.
abide by these rules.
Pienso que lo que
I
ellos
believe that
hacen es correcto,
what they do is
respetar las
correct.
reglas del juego,
That is to respect the rules of the game,
respetar el resultado de esas
to
elecciones,
respect the results of the
aunque se dieron
elections,
en condiciones
although
anormales,
they were held under
por
very
completo,
abnormal
y luchar para
conditions,
un día volver
and
a
to
ser la
struggle
mayoría del país.
so as to once again
Si no veo
have the
que haya
majority in the country.
desaparecido
So that
la
is,
revolución
I do not
sandinista,
think that the Sandinista
está
revolution has
atravesando
disappeared,
una etapa
but
diferente.
rather that it is undergoing a different
Espero que
experience,
gracias a su
a stage
esfuerzo
in which I hope,
logren un día recuperar
through their efforts, are able to recover the majority
nicaragüense.
of the support
Desde
of
luego,
the
la
people of
situación
Nicaragua.
es clara en el
Naturally,
país,
the situation in the country is not
compleja todavía, muy compleja.
clear.
No podemos decir
The
que se ha
situation is
alcanzado la
complex.
paz.
We cannot say that
Las
peace
organizaciones
has been achieved.
contrarrevolucionarias
Counter-revolutionary
no quieren
organizations
desarmarse,
do not want to disarm
han
themselves.
incumplido todos los acuerdos
They
de
have
desarme.
not abided by the
Las
disarmament
mejores
agreements.
armas, las reservas.
They have kept the
Hay
best
miles y
weapons,
miles de
and there are
contrarrevolucionarios
thousands and
armados.
thousands of armed
El gobierno le ha
counter-revolutionaries.
cedido una zona
The government has
de
granted them
20.000
an area of
kilómetros
20,000 square kilometers
donde van a tener incluso
where
una
they will
policía
even
propia,
have their own police
y
force,
donde seguramente
and
conservarán
where
su
undoubtedly
organización
they will probably
y conservarán
preserve
miles de armas,
their organizations
cual
and
crea una
thousands of
cierta
weapons,
dualidad de poderes,
which creates
cual
a
crea la
duality
existencia de dos
of
cuerpos
powers.
armados.
It means the existence of
Y
two
pienso que ese
armed
es una
forces,
situación de
and I believe that it is a
incalculable
situation
consecuencia,
that one
modo
does
que
not
no
know
podemos
what
afirmar que
consequences
todavía
it
se
might
ha
imply. So we cannot,
alcanzado la paz
as of yet, say that peace has been achieved
Nicaragua.
in Nicaragua.
Thank you very much. We must take another break now, but when we come back, we'll talk about the incidents that occurred in China last year. Stay tuned. Mr. President, what is your opinion about the student uprising in China last year?
Bueno, como es conocido, los
Well,
chinos llevaron
as
a cabo una
we
serie
all
de
know, the
reformas
Chinese
políticas
carried out
bastante radicales.
somewhat radical economic
Según ellos
reforms.
mismos expresan,
And according to what they themselves say,
hay aspectos políticos,
there are
aspectos
certain
sociales
political and
de
social
esas
aspects
reformas que no
implied in these reforms that were
suficientemente
not
atendidos.
sufficiently cared for.
De este modo se produjeron, por ejemplo,
So, for instance, there were problems of inflation,
incremento de precios, descontento
increased
en una
prices,
parte de la población.
discontent on the part of some
Ellos
sectors of the
también dicen que
population.
desatendieron
They also said
políticamente
that they were
el
not
trabajo con el pueblo, el trabajo
giving
con las masas.
correct care in political work with the masses, and that as a result of that, there was a certain discontent,
Los cuales explican los sucesos
which are the reasons for the
de Pekín.
Peking events. It is not the first time that the students take to the streets. On certain occasions, they have gone to support the government. I recall the period of the Cultural Revolution. There were millions of students in the streets with Mao Zedong's Red Book proposing measures. In this case, I cannot have a precise idea of the magnitude of this movement. But unquestionably, there were student demonstrations against the government, which, according to the Chinese officials, were used by elements that were discontent to try to detour China's socialist path and try to change socialism in China. I noted that the Chinese authorities made all possible efforts to avoid using force. Those events went on for weeks. And even the first soldiers that were sent to Peking were sent weaponless, and the world press reported those events. Until, at the end, fearing a generalized anarchy in that huge nation, they decided to use force to reestablish order there in Peking. And repression against the students have taken place everywhere in Europe. They are quite frequent. That is repression against the students, workers. They use dogs, tear gases, water bombs, etc. We can say that the Chinese do not have experience in struggles of this type. And when they face the problem for the first time, after more than 40 years, that is a movement against the government, unquestionably they lacked the mechanisms and resources that the entire West has to reestablish order whenever there are disturbances of this type. For example, since we're talking to the U.S., I would ask something. If in a city in the United States, the same thing would occur as what happened in Peking. If what happened in Peking were to happen in Washington and the situation was totally uncontrollable, how long would the United States have taken? And what means would the United States have used to reestablish order? I believe that they would have resorted to the National Guard. When there have been problems in some U.S. cities, they have resorted to the National Guard, they have resorted to the Army, and I am sure that the United States would not have allowed a situation, a chaotic situation, such as that in China for over a month. And the Chinese, the characteristic of the Chinese is their wisdom, not their violence.
To move on to another subject, do you think that capitalism and communism can peacefully coexist? And I even understand that you have some joint ventures here now in Cuba with some capitalist countries and companies. Is this true?
Well, since the first socialist state was founded, which was the Soviet Union, Lenin referred to the principle of peaceful coexistence. That was put forth in the revolutionary doctrine. Since the beginning, it is not new. I'm referring to the principle of peaceful coexistence, which has always been defended by the revolutionary movement. There must be something more than coexistence, but rather peaceful cooperation. And actually, these ideas are gaining grounds in the world. The idea of this cooperation is nothing new for us either. For more than 10 years, 10 years ago, we passed a decree law referring to the possibility of cooperation through joint ventures. That does not mean a change in conceptions. It does not mean that we are giving up socialism. It does not mean that we are not going to plan and program our development and our economy, which I believe are great privileges. That is, the possibility of being able to program our development, everything that man plans is always better than when things are produced spontaneously. I am convinced that the CNN prepares programs for a year, for 5 years, and maybe they have prospects for 10 years. Any great, any important entrepreneur, any man of industry knows that planning is necessary, programming is necessary. We believe that the development of a country must be planned. We have not renounced any of these possibilities of socialism. And we have found cooperation possibilities in the field of tourism and even in other fields. We have a tremendous tourist potential in the country. We can build in the country 250,000 rooms for tourism. We have hundreds of kilometers of Virgin Islands, extraordinary places, which as a whole are better than the rest of the Caribbean. What we did have some doubts for a certain period of time was whether we were to develop tourism or not, whether it was convenient or not. In the end, we reached the conclusion that tourism is a country's natural resource. And we are moving toward the development of tourism, not only with our own capital, because part of our tourism is being developed with our own resources, but also with foreign capital. Let's say, for example, I would say that 20% of the rooms being built now are being built through joint ventures. This is a new experience for us. The first hotels are already in operation. We visited some of them, and I believe that there are great prospects in this. They have tax possibilities. They do not have to pay any rent for 10 years. They do not have to pay any taxes with respect to the equipment that they import, which is their capital contribution. They do not have to pay any taxes for the import of the materials that they need to build for the hotel, and there are many advantages. And according to the estimates of the investors, they can recover their investment in 2 or 3 years. I think that very few countries have these possibilities.
Okay, we'll take another break now, and when we come back, we'll talk about third world debt. Thank you.
Para que vean el trabajo.
Míreme cómo es, chico. Mire la persona, que uno tiene que mirar a la persona cuando le habla.
¡Detríase! ¡Ocúpese, mete combate! ¡Lista!
Contraavión sobre 2, velocidad 220, 15. ¡Fuego!
Mr. President, in your opinion, what do you think needs to be done about the terrific debts of the third world?
Hace mucho rato pronostiqué.
A long time ago, I forecast that debt was unpayable and uncollectible. And facts are proving me right. The debt of many third world countries, even Latin America, it means that the dollar is worth 20 cents or 15 cents, 14 cents, 12 cents. And if at the end it is reduced to 1 cent or 0, in practice, the debt was unpayable and uncollectable. The thing is that the debt should have disappeared with one stroke. And I think that would have tremendously helped the world trade, because what the most developed countries have is a surplus of products. They have an underutilized industrial capacity, and what the rest of the countries of the world have are huge needs and little purchasing capacity. The overwhelming reality is that the gap grows between developed and underdeveloped countries. Some call them developing countries, but actually we can call them underdeveloped countries because they are increasingly distant from the developed countries. They have increasing problems of education, health, housing, food. And I think this is one of the most serious problems faced by the world of the future, and for which there is no response. And I do not think that the developed countries have any answers for the problems of the underdeveloping countries.
President Castro, from your standpoint, what do you see as the major stumbling block to normalizing relations with the United States?
Well, these stumbling blocks do not depend on Cuba. They depend on the United States. First of all, I believe that there is a lot of misinformation about Cuba, total misinformation. As a result of 30 years of negative campaigns and publicity on Cuba, as a result of which tens of millions of people in the U.S. simply do not know what is happening in Cuba. On the other hand, the government of the United States has banned the visit of people from the U.S. to Cuba. It is not possible to have greater contact between the people of the U.S. and Cuba because of this. So there's a lot of prejudice with respect to Cuba, and that does not allow the emergence of forces capable of defending a more realistic policy with respect to relations between Cuba and the United States. On the other hand, the United States had all sorts of slogans. When we were helping the Angolans to struggle against South Africa, they said that relations could not be improved as long as there were troops, Cuban troops in Angola. Naturally, we could not negotiate our relations with the United States based on Angola and Ethiopia. All these problems evolved, the situation in Southern Africa changed, and Cuba was able to withdraw its troops. The situation in the African Horn improved, and Cuba was able to withdraw its troops. The situation in Latin America has changed, and Cuba has improved its relations with most Latin American nations. They used to say also that when Cuba stopped exporting revolution, that's a very abstract, generic idea, but it has been very whimfully used. But the true fact is that they used to wage war on us, and we were forced to defend ourselves from all those who united the U.S. to blockade Cuba. These circumstances changed, and as a result of that, the policy of Cuba changed with respect to Latin America as a rule. Now the United States is always inventing a new condition or requisite. And now the conditions are of a domestic nature for relations to improve. And I must say very categorically that our country will never accept any internal conditions that have to do with the internal policy of the country to improve our relations with the United States. It is as if we would tell the United States that in order to improve relations with Cuba, they have to change something in their economic system, in their political system, or that they must have certain domestic policies, because we could elaborate a long list of things that we could demand from the United States as to its domestic policy. We could demand the disappearance of the consumption of drugs. We could demand, for example, that abandoned children disappear, that old age people lack homes, the disappearance of jobs, of unemployment. We could demand the disappearance of poverty, of the homeless, of racial discrimination, discrimination against blacks, Hispanics, etc. We could demand tens of things from the United States. But anyone can understand that it is absurd for us to require changes in the domestic policy of the United States to improve relations. So there would have to be a change in the mentality of the U.S. administration. The opinion would have to change, and people or possibilities would have to emerge for the U.S. people to have a better image. It's not a question of image, but rather to have better information, true information with respect to Cuba. I believe that the mass media could help improve that image, not that image, but rather that idea, the information. I believe that this work that you're doing on positive and not negative things can help to improve the level of information. But I believe that time will have to pass until the problems that hinder improvement of relations would have to pass. I'm not very optimistic as to this.
We'll take another break now, and we'll be back in just a moment. Stay tuned.
No, pero hay de química también.
Pero hay pocos estudiantes ahora. ¿Ya se resuelve el problema eléctrico?
No se resuelve, comandante.
Ya la estación esa que iban a hacer.
What about the station that was going to be built?
Yo llegué corriendo porque nos enteramos en la facultad que estaba aquí nuestro líder, ¿no? Entonces sentimos mucho.
I came on running because we got noticed that the leader of the revolution was here in the faculty.
Para todo nuestro pueblo, saber que está Fidel en un lugar significa algo muy grande, ¿no? Salimos enseguida corriendo para ver.
For every people here, everywhere, it is a tremendous news to know that Fidel is in the place. So that's why I came in running to see him.
Mr. President, would you please tell us your perspective of the U.S. government's attempts to block the televising of the Pan Am Games in the United States?
Efectivamente.
Right there
Hay un intento
is an attempt
sostenido
on a sustained basis to
que los Juegos Panamericanos
impede
sean transmitidos
the televising of the Pan American Games to the United States.
Esto busca un objetivo.
There is a goal in this.
Pretende privar de recursos
The purpose
al
is
país
to
para la
deprive
competencia
the
panamericana.
country of resources for the Pan American Games. Probably the government of the United States ignores
Los derechos que se reciben
that the
por las transmisiones de televisión
rights received
son
due
una cosa
to
muy pequeña
TV broadcasts
comparado
are
con
very
el gasto
small
que hay que hacer en unos
if
Panamericanos.
compared with the expenditures that must be made in the Pan American
También
Games.
es posible que Estados
It is also
Unidos quiera
possible that the United
boicotear,
States would like to boycott
los Juegos Panamericanos.
the
No tendría
Games.
ninguna base legal,
There would be no legal grounds for this, no moral
sería una
grounds for
falta
this.
de ética
It would
tremenda,
be totally
puesto que
unethical
Cuba había hecho
because
un arreglo
Cuba
con las autoridades
had reached
deportivas
an agreement with the U.S. sport authorities
cuando se dieron las
when
conferencias,
the
competencias en Indianápolis.
Indianapolis Games took place. And we
Y contribuimos
participated
a la
and contributed
competencia.
to make these games more
Digo
brilliant.
esto
I say
porque
this
ha habido a veces
because
rumores.
there have
No
been
creo que
rumors. I don't think
creo que
it will
Estados
happen. I
Unidos
don't think the United
error
States
político
will make the political and ethical mistake
de boicotear
of
los
boycotting
Panamericanos.
the Pan American Games.
This one is one that a lot of people have been asking because you're probably, certainly one of the strongest personalities running a country today. What plans have you been making for your succession? What will happen to Cuba after Fidel Castro is gone?
Mire, hay una tendencia grande,
There
sobre
is
todo en Occidente,
a generalized
a
trend in the
asociar
West
los acontecimientos
to relate
históricos
historic events
a las personalidades
to
de los políticos. Y
personalities.
por eso te oye muy frecuentemente
And that is
la
why
frase,
you frequently hear Castro's Cuba, what Castro said, what Castro did. Everything
no
is
acaban de
Castro.
comprender que ningún hombre
They can't understand
solo
that no single man can
que los
do
acontecimientos históricos
things on his own,
son
and that
tareas
historic
fundamentalmente
events
de los pueblos.
are responsibilities of the peoples, of millions of peoples, of tens of leaders, hundreds of leaders, thousands of cadres. They are the ones that make events possible. How could a single man defend his country? They can only do it when millions of people are ready to defend it. How could a single man make a revolution? We had men as extraordinary as Martí, who died in the war. However, that in the long run did not impede the independence of Cuba, nor a revolution as radical as socialism, which at present is being carried out in our country. Cuba lost many men that were highly capable throughout our history, and that did not hinder the development of our people. That is why. Independent of this tendency of giving credits only to men, that will not have any influence in the future of our homeland, and I am convinced of that.
How do you hope that the world will remember you?
I don't know how the world will remember me, but I simply hope that the world, and especially our people, remember me as what I really am.
Muchas gracias, señor Castro.
Muchas gracias a usted por la paciencia que ha tenido.
For a printed transcript of this special program, send $5 to CNN Transcripts, Journal Graphics Incorporated, 267 Broadway, New York, New York, 10007. To order by credit card, call 212-227-READ. Rush and fax service are available.